So the title of this talk is Skydiving Resilience Engineer. So I used to work at Bloomberg with the resilience engineering team. There's folks here that are still on that team that you can talk to here at the conference. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the takeaways there, but they are better people to go to. I now work as a SRE for post-trade engineering at Citadel. And so we'll talk a little more on the onboarding process and the training for skydiving. So I'm here to convince you that jumping out of a good plane is good for your career. That being said, I'm not qualified as an instructor. As Sarah has mentioned, I'm a recently licensed skydiver. So what this means is that I will highlight some things that I thought were really good parallels between skydiving and SRE practices. But you should always consult the official documentation, talk to someone that's licensed, go read the code and see what's going on. So the main things I want to focus on is like how do people handle risk management when it's super personal and they know that there is a risk. This is inspired by similarly themed talks, one given by Sarah last year about the intersection with incident response in the medical field and how scalability and reliability work in restaurants. So let's address the elephant. What is the risk of skydiving? So I pulled some stats here just from the general collection. We'll see that, I don't know if it's readable, skydiving is roughly 1 in 500,000 fatality. This is pulled from the USPA safety statistics. So they are a voluntary organization that compiles a lot of incident reports and keeps statistics throughout the years. If you go on the website, you'll see that it's steadily declined, so it's become quite a safe sport. There are roughly about 3 million jumps per year. A lot of people do it, and the incidents that tend to occur are with experienced skydivers trying to push the limits of skydiving. So if you look into what swooping is, I'm not going to describe it here, but it's quite problematic. So since we're SREs, we know that when you do risk calculations, this is a serial risk calculation. You can't convince someone that jumping out of airplane is safer than not jumping out. Your risk factor here is actually going to the drop zone, going up through the plane, and jumping out. But relatively, it's quite safe. One of the comparisons that people like to give is between shark attacks, commercial air flights. And there's a few reasons for why those are a lot scarier and why it's a risk. Some of these are well studied, things like whether or not you're in control of the situation, and whether there's repeated exposure. You see people driving every day, and the lethality of the cases that you hear about. So there's an idea I want to highlight here called the bus factor. Most people are well aware of it. It's not just an SRE principle, it's a business practice, continuity practice. The point of the bus factor is to ensure that business will not be crippled if a team member disappears, whether by lottery or attrition or other means. Many teams will naturally creep towards silos and take on that risk because it's not something that we take very seriously. As a skydiver on the weekends, your team might perceive the risk a lot higher, and this has an interesting benefit of ensuring replication of knowledge across your team. This is kind of a tongue-in-cheek benefit, so maybe we'll go into some more interesting ones. This is maybe harder to read, but I think it's the first is that we're normalizing working with risk. What I found in the skydiving community is that whenever they go up, they're acknowledging that it's a risky behavior, and they're planning for mitigations. There's a natural curiosity to make sure that you understand what is going on and to assess the risk of the jump. The next is incident management. Going through the practice of skydiving taught me a lot about how to do good incident management, good training, and how to handle all the preparations before you actually are on call. And the final, I think, is there's an aspect of emotional resilience here, knowing how you react under stress and becoming comfortable with being in the hot seat. If there is a problem, knowing that you have training and knowing that you have things to fall back on. So the first time you go skydiving in the US, most times it's a tandem skydive. It's with someone else. You're strapped to a stranger who knows what they're doing. It's kind of like shadowing your first on-call. what usually happens is your tandem instructor is specifically trained, and they will give you a few instructions related to body positioning. This is particularly important just for aerodynamics, so they can control just in case there's a crisis. What I like to highlight about this is that the new variable to the system when you go skydiving is you. When you're first on call and you're joining a new team, the newest factor is going to be you. When you're dealing with the system, they're kind of relying also that you don't freak out. So that you don't remove all the files or MRF by accident or run something that you're not supposed to without understanding the system. There's a fun fact here that when you go tandem skydiving, the risk to the instructor is too dangerous to have a helmet on, so they're actually the ones with the helmet and you're just strapped in front. But hopefully when you go up, you'll see that there's a lot of experienced people on the team that are having fun, that have done this for quite a while, that understand the system and are relaxed. One big part of this is like being able to have fun. So like our software systems, basics of mitigating risk, our servers have redundancy, so there's a backup parachute in case of a main parachute failure. There's automated alerts, so an audible altimeter will page if you reach a designated altitude without going under a parachute, for example. One of the things that I found was that there are decision altitudes for all of your jumps. These have a good safety margin for when you're first jumping, but they also give enough time to trigger. So I think this is something that we don't have as much in the on-call community. Most pages are tuned so that you know there's a problem and you have to be acting, and there isn't enough room to react or for someone new on call to be able to triage and understand the system. The final thing that is active for all of your jumps is a automatic safety trigger. This doesn't have as much of an application to software systems. We usually don't have something that's as clear-cut, but there is an automatic device that will detect whether your velocity and your altitude are too low and you're moving too fast, and this will trigger it for the backup system. So how do you prepare for your first skydive? So the USPA is a voluntary organization, but they also are pretty much the de facto licensor in the US. They have a list of requirements and goals. As listed, the A license takes about 25 where you first get situated. But the jumps are actually a lot scarier now. You don't have the expertise of someone strapped to you that's going to be doing most of the work. You are now the person in control. You are deploying your parachute. You have to understand the system. And so I found this is pretty similar to your first on-call, where you don't understand where to go for monitors, where to go for the Wikipedia pages, how to go to triage your alert, or what systems or tools that you might be using. This is about getting your feet wet and understanding the situation. So there's two steps that you get when you first skydive. There's a gear checklist that you go through to understand the different components of your system and how they work together. This is a pretty simple walkthrough, but you find that this catches a lot of flaws in redundancy of systems. You'll find that if someone is missing a gear checklist, that they will often have forgotten to reset something or set something up. The next is having a pre-built plan. Every skydive you do, there is a plan on what you're doing on approach, the different points that you should be at the different altitudes. So on the right, there's little arrows that you may be able to see about the landing pattern. But this also applies to your altitude, which we'll talk about a little later. So one of the really amazing things at Skydive Spaceland, where I got my license, is the Malfunction Junction. So this is a really good training helper where they show a lot of the different possible failure scenarios. This is a kind of equivalent to your run books in your system. So every one of those little squares of images is a failure of a parachute. And you run through what would happen and really simulate the remediation steps. So in this case, either pulling your reserve or going through the motions of determining how to react to it. What I found is that this pretty well mimics the game listed in this SRE book, the Wheel of Misfortune, where you have on-call engineers triage simulated scenarios. This is a education tool primarily. So before you go on call, it'd be nice to know that your new employee or your new on-call person understands the system well and that it doesn't have any faults. Part of the things that they go over is talking about whether things are high-speed malfunctions or low-speed malfunctions. This doesn't really have a distinction very much in a lot of our software systems. We tend to treat all of our systems as high-speed malfunctions. When there's an error, we take care of it, and there's bleeding already in the case. Most cases don't have the ability to discern whether it's like a low-speed malfunction where you have room to try to triage and try to remediate. Both of these systems are, the point of determining whether it's a high-speed or a low-speed malfunction, it relates directly to altitude. So the whole point of determining whether or not you have enough altitude to try to remediate ties a metric back to your runbook plan. So here we have some thresholds that are predetermined before you go on the jump. We have a breakoff altitude where you break off from your group to reduce exposure, a deployment altitude where you actually try to activate your main canopy. And then the next two are a decision altitude and a hard deck. So these are kind of concepts that we don't really have in software. It's usually not as clear-cut where you have a simple metric that you can point to. But in a really simple system, this is something that we might want to consider. So a decision altitude is where you attempt to stop any fixes and you go straight to a reserve or backup. So instead of trying to roll something with a patch fix or try to recover something, maybe it's going straight to destructive backup. So I found this is also a great example for setting alerts. The first warning that you set for your audible altimeter is typically right after your decision, right after your deployment altitude. So if you are not under canopy, that is a pretty alert. And this tells you that you should have done something by then. Similarly with your decision altitude and hard deck, these are all things that you determine yourself. And what is interesting is that there's enough leeway for new jumpers to be able to react and have some safety margin. Unfortunately, I know this is not as applicable to our software systems. Most places are trying to tune their alerts, figure out how to get rid of noisy warning alerts, or try to determine what metric to pay attention to. But having your on-call have a padded window to triage is something that we should take into account. So one of the things that I found that quite interesting is that the difference in industries, the Air Force does not train their pilots for skydiving. And this is primarily because there's two aspects of skydiving. There is the free fall component and there is under parachute component. They actually take into reliability of the plane's engines, so they actually train just for impact and then for survivability, so how to survive in the woods or behind enemy lines. In the military, there is training for RSL, but they also deploy under the hard deck. So they typically deploy under like 1,000 feet or somewhere very close to the 2,000 feet, very close to the Earth. So if we take a look at our hard deck and decision altitude, typically they're even below the ability to triage and try to attempt to fix the error. Finally, in sport skydiving, we found that you kind of learn all these. You learn about the different altitudes, how important it is to only try 2 times, when you should be quitting and just going straight to reserve. So based on your usage of your system, there can be entirely different disaster scenarios. This is relevant to how we use our different software systems. If you're using Redis or Kafka, you may have a different throughput and different use case, and your protocols may be different depending on your use case. So one other thing I found is that the difference between how people regulate skydiving. So in some places, you actually need there's an optional gear check in the US. Once you're licensed, you don't need to ask someone to do a gear check for you. But in France, actually, what they enforce is that there needs to be a C license to do a gear check on you. What this means is go through that checklist and ensure that your parachute is not faulty. In the US, there is a mandate from the FAA about cloud cover. This essentially means don't go through it if you can't see through it. The reason for this is that we're quite a busy, the airspace is quite busy, and you don't want to encounter, as someone put it, high-speed aluminum. In other drop zones around the world, particularly I heard about Australia, there's some drop zones that are almost always cloudy throughout the year. What happens is they actually file with their equivalent of an FAA and determine that, all right, this is airspace that's restricted for pilots, and that there will be tandems or skydivers throughout this. So one thing I really found interesting is the concept of blameless postmortems. So they're not trying to, after every skydive, you're not trying to determine what was at fault, who screwed up. In a high stress environment, that becomes pretty, it makes the skydiver feel worse and usually doesn't lead to anything productive. So what they learned is they normalized that there's a debrief after every skydive, and they'll ask the skydiver to talk through their understanding. So when you are doing an incident response and someone has been on call, I found that it works pretty well that you have the person on call recount what happened, talk through what they think was the issue, and then meet in the middle if there are other facts. What they also do is they review any close calls. What I found is if you are coming too close to the tree line, if you ended up in the wrong place, what you could have done better, why you ended up there, and what led up to that impact, what led up to that decision. There's a lot of focus on verifying why something happened rather than finding out what the blame was. And the goal of this is always what can we do better? So there's actually a lot of public postmortems. If you look up on YouTube, there's something called the Friday Freakout, I think publishes weekly. You'll find that they have videos of people that have missed deployments, that have passed out, or whatever the occasion is. And what you'll find in every video, or most of the videos, is a complete incident response, self-documented about what happened, what they could have done, what they missed, and what could have gone better. All of these are also tracked in the USPA incident response that I mentioned earlier. So you can go on the website and see the public incidents from the last, I think it's 60 days. And they have the safety stats that are public for everyone. If you go on YouTube and search for any skydiving incidents, people self-post their cutaways when they deployed to reserve. And they talk about the decisions that happened straight up to that point. It's a very self-motivated sport where people are interested in trying to make things safer. Here's a kind of call to action. We heard earlier about Void and LFI, and those are places that I think we should all be contributing to. I went a little fast, so maybe we can take more questions. But I have some acknowledgements to make. Thank you to Skydive Houston, Spaceline Houston. They were the ones that showed me a lot of the training and have a bunch of different skydivers that have contributed concepts to this talk. If you're looking to get into skydiving, I have some takeaways on what we can do better with our systems. We can assume that failures will occur and actively plan for it. Every time someone goes up, they assume that there is a risk and they have pre-planned a lot of scenarios. When you're training for all-call, take time to go through your process to actually train with one of your new on-call systems. And try to differentiate between what are recoverable incidents and which ones go straight to backup. Try to research possibly an automated critical failure process. So this is something that we don't see very much, but having something fail over, like if there's too much risk to have a stopgap. What I think is really helpful is having pre-mediated thresholds to stop bleeding. When you're new to on-call and you're new to a team, having a deadline of saying like 30 minutes is when you should escalate is pretty helpful just for a new person. I think this is a stretch, but also build customizable warning thresholds to give leeway for new on-call. This may be a little harder, but if you have warnings set up versus errors, they may be able to page on that earlier. Normalize debriefings to focus on understanding, and please contribute to incident reports. And thank you. So there's some videos I want to highlight here. I think there's some pretty awesome things that are going out. Will Smith has a 3-minute video on what it's taught him about fear. There's a Harry Potter skydiving commercial where people have broomsticks or kitted out in costume. It's pretty cool. One of my possible goals. There's also nighttime jumps where people have gone out and coordinated a nighttime jump with flares. That's really cool to see. Just the organization that has to go into it. And there's people that have skydived into scuba diving straight away. So there's a lot of awesome things that go out there. I probably skipped a few points I wanted to make, but that is my talk.